welcome to module 4.2, and here we are going to revisit some of the access control concepts to re-emphasize certain things and go a little deeper into the access control issues. So, what happens in access control? So, access control is like a gatekeeper checking your ID and checking the validity of your ID before it lets you through, right. So, that is what access control is all about. So, when a user process is asking a resource, then there should be something like a reference monitor that will check against a security policy. So, we are talking about security policy, and then depending on the policy and the user's ID, it will decide whether you can access that resource or not, and that is the idea of access control. So, there is authentication process that starts the access control, because once you authenticate yourself, then only it will check against the security policy if you are also authorized to the access. So, authentication and authorization are two different things. Authentication is checking your ID, and authorization is seeing whether that ID has certain privileges or access rights. So, going by some of the terminology. So, first is identification. So, how do you identify yourself? So, a delivery person may show an employee badge, and in case of computer, user enters username. Authentication is the process of validating that what you are showing is genuine. So, you can the gatekeeper might read the badge and determine that it is real. It might actually scan the badge and the system may say that it is real, whatever. In case of user provides password, and the password username combination is checked that this is indeed that user's password. Once you have been authenticated, then the authorization comes when you are given permission for admittance or permission for using some resource. So, in this case the door is opened to allow the delivery person in once he has been authenticated, he or she has been authenticated. In this case, the user is authorized to log in, or user is authorized to do something else. Access is when you are given the access to specific resources, and so in this case delivery person may only have access to a mailbox, or user is allowed to have access only to specific files or specific part of the disk and things like that. Now, in terms of roles, so owner of a resource, custodian of a resource, and end user of a resource are distinguished. So, owner is a person responsible for the information. For example, the owner might decide that this is a very important resource and I do not want everybody to access it, I only want certain people to access it. So, that is what owner does, because owner knows what the value of that particular resource is. In case of a when you create a file, if the file is something that is only high privileged users should be able to access, then you would decide by providing specific access rights to certain set of people or certain set of entities such as processes. And so, for example, let us say an accountant creates salary.xlsx file, which is then says that the file only should be accessible by the department managers. Custodian is the individual who has been tasked to make sure that the policy decided by the owner is upheld. So, the custodian like the would be like the security administrator or system administrator, and he or she periodically reviews the security setting and maintains the record of access by end users, like or it may be an automatic security agent keeping track of what is happening in the system. It does not have to be human, and so this person sets and reviews security setting on the file. And in some cases, in small system, owner and custodian could be the same person. The end user is the user who accesses the information or accesses the resource for their task that they have to do, and end user is supposed to know the organization security guidelines and does not attempt to circumvent security, although the way the custodian is designed or custodian is tasked, if the end user does that, the custodian should be able to catch that. So, if an end user opens this file and he or she is not a department manager, then the system log or something should tell, or the system itself should be designed so that it is denying the access to the end user. And if you make a mistake in putting the configuration bits or whatever like access permission, then any end user might be able to open it, and that would be a security policy violation because of lack of implementation of the security control. So, in this case the other terms is that the end user is usually a subject, owner is a subject, custodian is a subject, and the resource is an object. So, owners or end users or custodians are responsible for securing the object's proper access control. So, and then the end user might identify herself as Mweli and then authenticate by using password or some two-factor authentication, whatever. Authorization will then go through the password, whatever the password control mechanism, like hashing the typed in password and match against the hash and things like that, and it welcomes and that is the authorization process if it goes through, and then the end user might access the resource, in this case the object salary.xlsx, and that is if and only if the subject has the access right. Now, few other things, and we talked about this before in the second lecture number 1 or the second lecture, which is mandatory access control versus discretionary access control. Then we are now talking about two more things. One is called the role based access control versus rule based access control. So, in mandatory access control, the end user cannot set the control. So, the control is, as we saw, that it's a system imposed restriction. So, even if you have access, you cannot, for example, change the access right for another user, whereas in discretionary access control, once you have access, you can do whatever you want. So, in that sense, mandatory access control is the most restrictive model, and the discretionary access control is the least restrictive model. In role based access control, you assign permissions to roles rather than individual users, and the reason is that roles such as administrator or root user, a specially privileged user or a common user, they should have different access rights, and it is easier to control it based on role, because if you have 100,000 users in your system, deciding for each user individually what access rights they have is so much more difficult, but you have only a limited number of roles, and based on those roles you can decide the access, and therefore it is much easier to manage. And rule based access control is that when you dynamically assign roles to subjects based on the set of rules set by custodian. So, in case of privileges de-escalation and so on, you can do this on a temporal scale rather than making it fixed for all the time. Now, the different systems like Unix, for example, access control has information should be there in some way or the other represented inside your system, so that whenever the reference monitor, for example, wants to check whether you have access to that particular resource, it should be able to consult that information in some kind of a data structure or something. So, one such thing was access control matrix defined by Lampson, and so Butler Lampson, he basically said that you have users and you have different files. So, files are the resources, and for example, in Unix most things are treated as files. So, then you can say for each user you can fill the matrix about what kind of permission they have for all the different resources. So, this access control matrix that is somehow one of the way to So, if you want to check whether user 3 has access to file 3, some kind of access right to file 3, or user 3 is trying to open file 3, you have to go into this box and see whether there is anything there, and then if it is not, then they will be denied access. So, access control list is another way, like adjacency matrix versus adjacency list in graphs. Access control list is basically another way of representing the access control matrix, where for each person you will have or for each object or each file you will have the list of users who have access and what kind of access they have. Now, there is another thing, another way of enforcing access control, which is based on capability model. So, capability is something like a ticket. So, user holds a particular capability token or a ticket for each resource, and then it basically will use that to access that particular resource, and this can be much more dynamic, and as we will see that some of that has been implemented in, for example, Windows model for access control. So, we are seeing that there are two variations. One is you run or you maintain a source wise list for and which users have access to that resource and in what kind of access, or you can have a unforgeable ticket that can be used in the user space, and user presents the ticket, basically sends the token, and then if the token matches, then the user is granted access, otherwise not. So, access control lists are widely used, often with groups. So, you can have group wise permission, and some aspects of capability concept is also used in many systems. So, access control list, again a set of permissions attached to an object. So, in Microsoft Windows, if you open for a doc or anything, any file or any directory, you right click and open properties, then you will see that there is a security tab, and that security tab will kind of give you the access control list, and usually it is kind of role based. So, it is not like it is basically group or username. So, you can give access to groups or you can give access to specific users, and it also tells you for example, if you click on them, what kind of things among these things they have permissions for. So, and this entry in the access control list is called a ACE or ACE or an access control entry. So, comparing access control list based access control versus capabilities based access control. So, access control list will associate lists with each object, check a user or group against the list. So, if somebody is trying to access it, if the user has access, then it will check with the list and see if it has access. If the user does not, it will check what group the user belongs to, and if the group has access of a different kind, like maybe not necessarily write, but maybe read, then it will also allow that. It relies on authentication, because when a user tries to open a file, before that the user has been authenticated through password, username or some other token. So, it needs to have that done before, because otherwise it will not know which user it is. Now, as you know that passwords can be stolen, and therefore this access control may also be compromised. Now, capability is an unforgeable ticket. So, that means is that it is some kind of a digital string, maybe a random bit sequence or managed by the operating system, and it can be passed from one process to the other. And so, reference monitor checks the ticket and validity of the ticket, and it does not need to know who the user or process is. As long as you have the ticket, the reference monitor will give you access. So, in access control, for example, if process P is running as user U and it creates a process Q, let us say through a fork, then it will also run as user U unless process Q is a set UID program. In that case, it can be changed, and then same thing if it spawns another process R, then it will also run with user use privilege. So, it is kind of like inherited like that, whereas in capability based model, when you create a new process, you do not have to pass all the capabilities to the other process. So, that gives you much fine grained control than what you can get in the access control list based paradigm. So, delegation wise, the capabilities model allows processes to pass capability at runtime, whereas in ACL it is harder to pass the capability, because you have to then make the user go and do a system level change in the permission. For example, if you want suddenly during your runtime that you want access to a certain file for which you do not have, only a way is that the owner of that file or a higher privileged user of that file can actually change the access bits of that file, and that is usually not possible because that requires human intervention. So, other option is that if you are suspecting that your process is going to dynamically decide what kind of access rights it might need on a file, then it might be good to design that process as a set UID process, and therefore dynamically change the user ID and thereby effective user ID, and thereby not having to go through that human intervention. The other issue is that when you want to revoke access, so in ACL or access control list, what you can do is you can remove the user group from the list. So, if you want that, okay, this object is I think it's no longer should be available to this user, you can just go and change the access permission for that user for that object. Whereas capability, getting a capability back from a process is much more problem unless you are doing a very meticulous bookkeeping, that at any point in time which process has what capabilities, and there has to be some way to revoke the capabilities from the process. Usually a capability is also used for multiple resources, so you have to revoke all or none. And then capability pointer to a resource, so revoke basically will mean that you have to set that pointer to 0, but that is implementation details, it is not that important. As I said that in Unix, for example, we do not do each user based decisions. Normally we assign roles to the users like administrator, power user, user, guest and so on, and we assign the permissions to the roles, and therefore it is much more easier to manage the access control. And then there is role hierarchy. So, all these roles have a partial order, like some roles have more access than others, access rights than others, whereas some are incomparable because they may have some and they may have a non overlapping set, or maybe an overlapping set but two incomparable sets and so on. So, and so, but if you look at the hierarchy here, you have administrators, power users, users and guests, and most probably the permissions are kind of a superset as you go up, and you can only list those permissions which are extra after the lower one. So, that is what they mean, is that list only the new permissions given to each role. So, role based access control pictorially sort of looks like this. Individuals are given roles and then the roles are assigned resources. So, indirectly the individual will only have access to those resources which that particular role allows. So, summary of access control. So, it involves reference monitor, checks the permission. A reference monitor could be some other process, or can be done by some system call. It checks permission of the user information and the action against the resource and say yes or no, and there is no way around this check. If it gets it has to go through this. Access control metrics accesses control lists, and also you can do this with capability model. and we saw that there are advantages, disadvantages of each in terms of delegation, in terms of revocation, and then role based access control. User can be put in a group, and the group will have access controls, and that's kind of a coarse grained access control, but it helps a lot in managing access control. So that ends module 4.2, and in the next we will go and look into some of these in how they are implemented in Unix and Windows.